before I tell you about the soap opera villain who shot a man in the face, the beloved weatherman who floated on a map while hiding decades of abuse, or Winston Churchill's daughter who may have never seen the inside of a cell at all, let me ask you this. What happens when the cameras stop rolling and the prison doors slam shut? Because tonight, we're not talking about Hollywood. We're diving into British fame, British scandal, and 13 familiar faces who traded soundstages for cell blocks. Some you'll remember, others you've deliberately forgotten. And one might be the biggest ghost story in entertainment history. This is the definitive account of celebrities who fell from grace, served their time, and discovered that public memory can be both forgiving and merciless, and sometimes in the same breath. Leslie Grantham, the murder that built Dirty Den. Let's start with a gunshot in Germany, 1966, and a young British Army private who would become one of the most watched villains in UK television history. But Leslie Grantham didn't begin his career on a BBC soundstage. He began it in a West German courtroom, standing trial for murder. Grantham was 19 years old when he attempted to rob a taxi driver. The details are stark and unchangeable. The gun discharged, the driver died, and Grantham's defense of accidental shooting failed to convince the court. The sentence was life imprisonment. The press barely registered it. This was 1966, long before EastEnders, long before 30 million viewers would tune in to watch him scheme and smirk his way through Christmas Day showdowns as Dirty Den. He served approximately a decade behind bars, and it was within those prison walls, in an environment where time loses structure and identity must be reconstructed brick by brick, that Grantham discovered acting. Prison theater became his rehearsal space for a second life. After his release, he enrolled in drama school, rebuilt himself from the ground up, and by the mid-1980s had transformed into one of Britain's most recognizable television anti-heroes. Dirty Den was never meant to be likable. He was meant to be detestable, which created a strange cultural buffer when Grantham's past inevitably resurfaced. The tabloids recycled his murder conviction with renewed intensity during various scandals, most notably an internet controversy in the early 2000s. But here's the remarkable part. The British public never fully turned on him. Perhaps because Dirty Den was always supposed to be a rogue, perhaps because Britain has a peculiar affection for redemption narratives, especially incomplete ones. Grantham's legacy remains permanently split. He is simultaneously the actor who returned from killing another human being and the killer whose crime never truly left him. His story opens a question Britain has never satisfactorily answered. What happens when prison actually works? When the convicted criminal genuinely re-enters society, reformed and repackaged for primetime viewing, do we celebrate the transformation or continue questioning who deserves the privilege of transformation at all? Ricky Tomlinson, jailed for picketing. Ricky Tomlinson never killed anyone, but his imprisonment would prove even more publicly visible and politically charged than Grantham's. Before the royal family made him a national treasure with his reclining chair and signature grunt, Tomlinson was one of 24 men incarcerated for participating in a strike. Let that statement sink in fully. He was jailed for picketing. The year was 1972. The height of Britain's industrial unrest. Tomlinson, then working as a builder and active trade unionist, joined picket lines during a national building workers' strike. What followed wasn't law enforcement. It was political theater dressed as law and order. He and his fellow strikers were charged with conspiracy to intimidate and affray. The courtroom proceedings were transparently political. The sentence was 2 years in prison, not for violence, not for assault, but for standing in the wrong location with the wrong people at the wrong historical moment. In a Britain terrified of working-class power, Tomlinson served his time. He emerged politically sharpened, vocally bitter, and publicly prepared to name names. For decades, he maintained that the prosecution was orchestrated by state apparatus. Secret files released years later appeared to confirm his claims. MI5 surveillance, systematic blacklisting, a quiet war waged against loud workers. The strangest element of Tomlinson's story is what happened next. His criminal record initially kept him off television for years. He lost jobs, his house, his marriage. But in the 1990s, a peculiar reversal occurred. The gruff ex-convict became the face of working-class comedy. As Jim Royal, he transformed laziness into protest art. As DCI Charlie Wise and Cracker, he brought authentic lived experience to fictional crime dramas. Audiences didn't reject his criminal past. They absorbed it into his character work. Eventually, even the courts acknowledged the injustice. In 2021, nearly 50 years after the strike, his conviction was formally overturned. Too late to undo the prison sentence, not too late to admit what it genuinely was: political punishment masquerading as criminal justice. This raises profoundly uncomfortable possibilities. If Tomlinson's imprisonment was a mistake, cloaked in legal legitimacy, how many other convictions are buried beneath similar facades of respectability? How many former convicts are famous not despite their criminal records, but because those records provided something the culture could mythologize? Stephen Fry, the teenage fraudster who became national treasure. Stephen Fry knows what it means to carry a criminal sentence within your personal narrative, but his arrest stemmed from panic and self-destruction rather than politics. Before he became the nation's intellectual uncle, before QY, Blackadder, or Oxford Union, debates that made wit feel like competitive sport, Stephen Fry was a teenage runaway with a stolen credit card and a remarkable talent for self-destruction. The year was 1975. He was 17 years old. The offense was fraud. The sentence was several months in youth detention at Pucklechurch Prison. Not exactly the origin story you'd expect from a man later knighted for services to literature and broadcasting, but therein lies the paradox. Fry's criminal past didn't destroy him. It became a form of ballast, evidence that brilliance could germinate in wreckage. His own retellings, polished by decades of self-deprecating charm, tend to soften the edges. He stole a friend's credit card, went on a spending spree, got caught, and spent time incarcerated. The facts are simultaneously clear and opaque. It's not that details are murky, it's that they never quite fit the expected narrative arc. Fry isn't the typical redemption figure. He didn't claw his way back from ruin through sheer determination. He spiraled into chaos, landed in confinement, and then somehow sidestepped both self-pity and public scorn. The sentence didn't define him. It folded itself into the narrative of a wayward genius who briefly lived on the edge between expulsion and artistic expression. There's an undeniable cultural double standard at work here. Most teenagers caught committing fraud don't end up hosting programs on Radio 4, but Fry was. And even then, something different, precociously articulate, deeply troubled, and protected at least partially by the invisible force field of posh privilege. Incarceration didn't brand him as menace, it branded him as misfit. That's not fairness, that's narrative convenience. Yet Fry has never pretended otherwise. His past, including subsequent breakdowns and bipolar diagnosis, has always been part of his public self. Not performatively, not with public relations gloss, but with an intellectual honesty that sidesteps demands for absolution. The crime never disappears. It simply gets reframed, leaving us with lingering discomfort. If a teenage con man becomes a national icon, what does that reveal about who gets forgiven and why? Judy Carne, the laugh-in star who fell without a safety net. Judy Carne didn't receive the same treatment. Her fall wasn't softened by charm or rebranded through cleverness. It was public, chaotic, and cruelly unforgettable. Once upon a psychedelic time, she was America's British darling. Judy Carne, wide-eyed, quick-tongued, and permanently mid-eye roll, was the first person many Americans heard say, "Sock it to me." But behind the catchphrase, behind wild fashions and lightning-fast sketch comedy routines on Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, was a downward trajectory with no laugh track. Her fame peaked rapidly in the 1960s. She was the perfect export, British, bold, and just unhinged enough to seem hip in Nixon-era television. But the chaos wasn't confined to the screen. Carne's personal life unraveled publicly, with arrests, addiction battles, and a rotating door of tabloid-friendly disasters. By the time she was arrested at Heathrow Airport for drug possession in early 1972, the British press had already begun writing her off as a lost cause. The conviction came with a 3-month sentence. Unlike other stars who managed to alchemize their prison time into gravitas or mythology, Carne was left with only stigma. Her reputation didn't harden into legend, it crumbled into pity. The narrative didn't forgive her, it simply moved on. The problem wasn't just the drugs or even the jail time, it was the optics. Carne was a woman in a media era that pathologized female collapse while glamorizing male dysfunction, the very qualities that made her lovable on-screen: irreverence, impulsivity. That glint of mayhem became liabilities when viewed through the lens of real-world trouble. Where Stephen Fry's youth detention became a footnote to genius, Judy's prison stint was rebranded as proof of personal failure. Yet, even in her downfall, there's something sharp-edged about Carne's legacy. She wasn't tragic in the weepy biopic sense. She was inconvenient, brash, and impossible to domesticate. That's what made her unforgettable. That's what got her punished. Her later life was quieter. She returned to Britain, wrote a candid autobiography, and lived far from the spotlight. But her time in prison, brief as it was, remains a symbol of how quickly fame curdles when the story stops fitting the approved script. Alan Lake, the doomed romance of Diana Dors' husband. Our Alan Lake could have played himself if anyone had dared write a script that bleak. A handsome, brooding actor with a dangerous edge, Lake embodied both the promise and the warning of 1970s British television. He had the look, the voice, the tragic romance. He also had a temper, a drinking problem, and a tabloid reputation built like a bonfire. By the time he was jailed for his role in a pub brawl, he was already teetering on the edge of self-destruction. The specifics of the fight weren't glamorous, just another flash of violence in an era that excelled at disguising dysfunction as charm. But the sentence, 18 months in prison of which he served approximately 1 year, stripped away what remained of his public veneer, not because it shocked anyone, but because it confirmed the image everyone suspected. Lake's notoriety wasn't purely personal, it was marital. He was married to Diana Dors, herself a former tabloid goddess and Britain's eternal Monroe. Together, they were a real-life soap opera. Glitter, scandal, tragedy. When he went to prison, it played like another act in a doomed love story. Yet what prison did to Alan Lake wasn't theatrical, it was corrosive. His already fragile career took a hit from which it never fully recovered. Producers stopped calling, casting agents quietly moved on. By the time he was released, the offers that came were few and mostly insignificant. The industry had a method of pretending not to notice its damaged goods, but it never genuinely welcomed them back. The irony is that he was actually talented, a compelling actor with depth, range, and presence. But talent doesn't always survive reputation, but especially when reputation is fed on a continuous loop of violence, alcohol, and prison headlines. In the years that followed, Lake's life unraveled in ways the tabloids never truly understood. They just printed the outcomes. He became a cautionary tale, the kind whispered about in green rooms and remembered in memorial segments. The sentence, the jail time, the violence, it wasn't a one-off scandal. It was a turning point from which no one turned back. Chris Hargreaves, from Coronation Street to drug dealer. Chris Hargreaves didn't have a household name. He had a Coronation Street credit, a few bit parts, a soap career built on side characters and day player appearances. But then the credits stopped rolling and the headlines took over. In 2016, our Hargreaves was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison after being caught running a small but organized drug operation, cannabis mostly, plus charges related to money laundering and supply with intent. It wasn't glamorous crime. It was logistics, street-level commerce. But the press latched onto the phrase they loved best. Ex-soap star turned drug dealer. The story practically wrote itself. Former actor swaps fake drama for real crime. TV land to underworld. Just like that, a career's worth of minor fame became a major cautionary tale. Hargreaves' case wasn't just about the crime. It was about how rapidly the industry forgets you once your usefulness expires. One day you're on set filming over-rehearsed confrontations in a make-believe pub. The next, you're behind bars for something that happens in the alley outside one. The transition was seamless, almost poetic, if it weren't so devastatingly real. The court didn't go easy on him, and neither did the media. Every story made certain to remind readers exactly where they'd seen his face before, even if it had only been for 5 minutes on a Thursday evening in the 90s. That's the reality of ex-TV actors. They're public enough to punish, but too obscure to protect. After sentencing, Hargreaves disappeared from the entertainment industry completely. No redemption tour, no podcast confessionals, just another name in the long list of "Where Are They Now" articles that end in a mugshot. His story doesn't inspire outrage or moral panic. It barely inspires memory. But perhaps that's the point. Not every fall from grace is headline-worthy. Some are just slow collapses into invisibility, accelerated by one bad decision, one sting operation, one moment when the door slams and the role ends for good. Brian Regan, the Brookside actor and the gangland killing. Brian Regan wasn't the kind of actor you'd expect to see linked to a gangland shooting. Then again, Britain's underworld has always had a flair for unlikely casting. Regan had a decent television resume, best known for a recurring role on Brookside. He drifted through British screens in the 80s and 90s, part of that familiar breed of steady, unglamorous performers who built careers on regional dramas and reliable supporting roles. Not a star, but recognizable, the kind of face your mother might spot in a rerun and say, "Him again." But in 2012, Regan wasn't playing a part. He was in court, not costume. The charge, involvement in a real-life gangland killing. And he wasn't the shooter, but prosecutors alleged he drove the gunman, helped cover tracks, and then attempted to throw investigators off the scent. The technical term was perverting the course of justice. The moral weight, however, was considerably heavier. The headlines practically begged for drama. Soap star caught in underworld web. TV villain turns real-life accomplice. While the murder trial eventually cleared him of direct responsibility for the killing, he was still sentenced to nearly 5 years in prison, a supporting role, but in a crime that ended in someone's death. What made it all stick in public memory wasn't just the crime. It was the timing. Regan's arrest happened years after his TV heyday, during a period when his name had faded from relevance. The case jolted it back, grotesquely amplified. In a perverse way, the scandal made him famous again. Not the kind of fame anyone wants, but in Britain's tabloid ecosystem, notoriety often outpaces merit. The courtroom was grim. The coverage was relentless. When the reporting ban lifted, the floodgates opened. He was, for a few weeks, the most talked-about ex-soap actor in the country. And then, as these stories often go, silence. No redemption tour, no tearful interviews, just a man walking out of prison into a career that no longer existed. His story feels like the midpoint of something, a reminder that not all collapses are about ego or addiction. Some are about proximity, the wrong people, the wrong choices, the wrong place in the car. John Alford, the teenage heartthrob's definitive fall. He was a teenage heartthrob once. John Alford had that 90s charm, boyish face, cocky grin, and just enough edge to make him a fixture on shows like Grange Hill and London's Burning. He was the kind of actor who seemed destined to age into something bigger. Maybe not a superstar, but a mainstay, a lifer, someone who'd always have a place in the nostalgic backrooms of British TV. That version of Alford disappeared long ago. By the time his criminal case reached court in 2006, Alford wasn't a fixture of anything but the archives. The charges were serious. He was convicted of multiple sexual offenses involving underage girls. The trial was high profile, the coverage was intense, and the sentence, 8.5 years, was definitive. There was no ambiguity, no debate, no room for interpretation. This wasn't a tabloid scandal designed to titillate or speculate. It was a closed case, on the kind that redefines a man's name so thoroughly that any previous career, any cultural footprint, is effectively erased. Alford didn't just lose his platform, he lost the permission to exist within public nostalgia. It's important to understand the shift here. Decades ago, similar cases were whispered about, softened, or buried. But post-2000s, Britain operates differently. The public appetite for accountability, especially in the entertainment world, has grown sharper, more surgical. There's less room for image management. When someone's convicted of crimes like this, the conversation ends. Alford's story now exists only in the past tense. He is not discussed as a performer, a former child star, or a could have been. He is discussed in court documents, crime reporting, and public registries. His fall wasn't gradual. It was seismic and final. There's no clever ending here, no ironic reflection or bittersweet twist. Just a complete severing of cultural memory from personal history. One day, he was a familiar face from after-school television. The next, he was a case number. Philip Foster, the Brookside actor who built a fraud empire. Some actors disappear into obscurity. Philip Foster disappeared into a fraud investigation. In the 1990s, he was a minor name on Brookside, a familiar soap face in a decade flooded with them. Not a star, not even a major supporting lead, just another working actor doing the circuit. And then he was gone. Not in the usual sense of fading careers or tabloid scandal, but in the literal paper trail sense. Years passed, and then he reappeared in the news for something far more lucrative than soap scripts: fraud on a massive scale. The headlines came in 2005. Foster had been sentenced to 8.5 years in prison for orchestrating a multi-million-pound scam involving sham modeling agencies. The scheme was slick, predatory, and methodical. Desperate young people were lured in with promises of stardom, charged upfront fees, and then abandoned with nothing. It wasn't just deceit, it was infrastructure. He'd built an entire machine around the illusion of opportunity. There's something uniquely cruel about this kind of con. It exploits hope, ambition, and the very dreams Foster once tried to live out himself. And that's the dark irony. He sold others the fantasy of fame using the residue of his own. A washed-up actor selling counterfeit stardom. You can't script that kind of symmetry. What made the story especially gripping was the scale. This wasn't a one-off. It was a sprawling, multi-year operation complete with company fronts, false contracts, and enough victims to make it a national case. City of London investigators uncovered the whole operation with forensic detail, and the court didn't hold back. Foster was framed not as a tragic figure, but as a calculating manipulator who turned his industry knowledge into a business model for exploitation. There was no public apology, no statement of remorse, just silence, and a prison sentence that effectively closed the curtain on any chance of public rehabilitation. Because unlike some crimes that leave a sliver of ambiguity or room for redemption, Foster's didn't. His downfall wasn't about weakness, it was about strategy. To Stuart Hall, it's a knockout star's spectacular downfall. There was a time when Stuart Hall was British television. The booming voice, the theatrical gestures, the surreal chaos of It's a Knockout. He embodied a kind of family-friendly madness that defined a generation of BBC entertainment. Loud, absurd, and endlessly watchable. But by the 2000s, Hall's legacy imploded. His name, once shorthand for campy nostalgia, became synonymous with the reckoning that overtook Britain's entertainment world in the wake of the Jimmy Savile scandal. Historic allegations, long buried and long unprosecuted, were suddenly at the center of a national inquiry into who knew what and when. Hall was convicted in 2013 for multiple indecent assaults, with charges relating to incidents decades prior. This led to an initial 15-month sentence. Public outrage saw that term doubled on appeal. And just like that, Hall's persona, once irrepressible, unshakable, shattered completely. The man who used to host games involving foam hammers and falling over in costume was now a face on the evening news, flanked by grim voiceovers and court sketches. His crimes weren't the murky kind the tabloids love to speculate about. They were proven, on record, and the result was one of the most abrupt erasures in British media history. Hall didn't just fall from grace, he was actively scrubbed from it. TV archives were pulled. Clips vanished. Institutions distanced themselves with remarkable speed. There was no nuance left to debate, just a full stop. And yet it took decades to get there. That's the part that sticks. Hall was in the public eye for half a century, beloved, even celebrated. When he received an OBE, gave interviews, published autobiographies, all while victims were living with memories no one believed, or worse, ignored. His conviction became a turning point, not just for himself, but for how the public viewed the generation of entertainers who'd once been untouchable. In the space of one trial, a man once considered safe enough for family tea time became proof of how long systems can protect the wrong people. Rolf Harris, the national institution who fell the hardest. Rolf Harris was everywhere. For over 4 decades, his voice, his art, and his peculiar blend of music and mischief became fixtures of British childhoods. He painted the Queen. He hosted variety shows. He taught generations how to wobble a board and call it music. For many, he was more than famous. He was institutional, the kind of figure who showed up at charity events, royal functions, and Christmas specials like a warm cardigan nobody questioned. Until the questions came. In 2014, Harris was convicted of a string of indecent assaults with offenses spanning decades. The trial was public, damning, and brutal in its clarity. He was sentenced to 5 years and 9 months in prison. Overnight, the national institution became a national reckoning. His OBE was stripped. His paintings were removed from gallery walls. Broadcast networks scrambled to erase decades of programming that once centered him as a friendly authority figure. But the most unsettling part wasn't the conviction itself. It was how long the myth had held. Harris had thrived in the era when celebrity insulated you, when affability was armor. He was the sort of entertainer whose persona was so deeply entrenched in public memory that the truth had to crash through layers of nostalgia just to be heard. The fallout wasn't just professional, it was cultural. The collapse of his legacy wasn't a rebranding, it was an obliteration. Footage that once charmed now felt eerie. Public performances turned into cautionary tales. Every old clip played like a warning we'd missed. There was no redemption arc, no final performance, no quiet goodbye. Harris died in 2023, disgraced and largely erased. His obituaries split between the man he was and the damage he left behind. What remains is a lesson about how charisma can delay consequence but never cancel it. Fred Talbot, the weatherman on the floating map. Fred Talbot had a gimmick. While most weathermen pointed vaguely at pixelated clouds, he stood on a floating map in the middle of the water and delivered forecasts with a cheerful awkwardness that made him oddly endearing. For a time, he was one of the most recognizable faces on regional and national British television. The man was practically a meme before memes existed. He was supposed to be safe, bland, dependable. That was the point of TV weather personalities, reliable presences who made the unpredictable feel manageable. But the predictability was a lie. Talbot's fall came later in life, long after his television career had faded, when most had forgotten his name entirely. In 2015, Talbot was convicted of multiple offenses against teenage boys and sentenced to 4 years in prison. And a later case brought more time, another 8 months added to his record. What made the coverage feel uniquely dissonant was the sheer ordinariness of his past image. Talbot wasn't bombastic or theatrical. He wasn't a larger-than-life persona like some of the others who fell. He was genial, middle-aged, mild. And in that contrast between appearance and action, his case cut especially deep. Like Stuart Hall and Rolf Harris, Talbot's offenses were historic, long unprosecuted, long unacknowledged. And like them, his conviction fit into the wider post-Savile reckoning that forced Britain to reassess its trust in familiar figures. The institutions that once granted him a platform now moved swiftly to disown him. Archive footage was pulled. Media retrospectives cut him out like a contaminated frame. But while the legal proceedings gave closure, they didn't erase the discomfort. Talbot's face had been a background character in so many lives, just another part of morning routines and childhood memories. And that's what made the betrayal feel personal. He wasn't just a name on a charge sheet. He was in the living room day after day, smiling gently while hiding something else entirely. It's a brutal sort of narrative symmetry, the way public trust builds over time and collapses in an instant. Sarah Churchill, the ghost story that won't die. Not every story on this list is about conviction. The final name belongs to a figure who might not have served time at all, at least not in any provable way. Sarah Churchill's prison tale remains a whisper, a rumor, a ghost story in the margins of British fame. Some reputations are forged in scandal, others are haunted by it. Sarah Churchill, The actress daughter of Winston Churchill falls into the latter category, a life shaped less by what she did than by what people said she might have done. Among the many rumors orbiting her name, one persists above the rest, that she spent time in Holloway Prison for drunk and disorderly behavior. The story crops up in scattered biographies and late-night trivia forums. Some versions place her in a cell for a few days. Others suggest it was merely a stint on remand. But the odd thing is, for all its repetition, there's very little hard evidence. No mainstream court documentation, no definitive archival reporting, just that classic whisper, repeated so often it starts to sound like truth. And why does it stick? Because it fits. Because Sarah Churchill's life, though cloaked in aristocratic lineage, was a messy, undramatic tangle of rebellion and restlessness. She was a gifted performer with a sharp wit, a defiant streak, and a complicated relationship with the press. She starred in films like Royal Wedding alongside Fred Astaire, yet headlines often paid more attention to her drinking, her divorces, her volatility. The idea that she might have wound up in a jail cell at some point doesn't feel like a stretch, but that doesn't make it a fact. This is where history gets murky, not in what happened, but in what we need to believe happened. The alleged Holloway episode is plausible, yes. It would have been era-appropriate, quietly managed, and politely buried, especially for the daughter of a wartime prime minister. But without a paper trail, it remains hearsay, a biographical footnote trying to pass as a headline. It also reveals something deeper about how Britain treats legacy. Sarah Churchill was not merely a celebrity. She was a Churchill. Her failures were amplified, her defiance magnified. The system that might have quietly punished someone else punished her publicly, but ambiguously. If she was jailed, it was concealed. If she wasn't, the rumor itself became the punishment. And so Sarah remained suspended in the strange purgatory between myth and memory. Not quite exonerated, not quite convicted, just another figure whose real story is drowned out by the echo of a juicier one, which perhaps is the most British fate of all, not to be scandalized, but to be speculated about endlessly. 13 names, 13 stories. Some served their sentences and rebuilt. Others were erased from public memory entirely. One might never have been imprisoned at all. But what connects them isn't just the crimes or the convictions. It's what happens after. The strange alchemy of public memory, the selective nature of forgiveness, and the brutal reality that in Britain, as in Hollywood's golden age, fame can be both armor and target. Some of these figures transformed their prison time into mythology. Others were crushed by it. And one remains forever suspended in rumor, a ghost story we keep telling because it fits too perfectly to let go. Because when the cameras stop rolling, what happens next isn't fiction. It's history. And history, as we've seen tonight, has a very long memory, and a very selective one.